can be made to agree to these kinds of medical interventions. We have two experts for this. One is Meredith Miller, and the other one is Ariane Billeran, both of whom know a lot about psychology. Who wants to start? Meredith, I'm sorry to keep you waiting for so long.
No worries. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. So for the last 2 years, we have witnessed around the world the same patterns of abuse dynamics that we see in interpersonal relationships. And I'm speaking in terms of psychological abuse, which is mostly invisible, yet very real, insidious, and pervasive in the life of an individual who's been targeted. So over the years of working with clients who are victims and survivors of abuse, only a small percentage of the people that I've worked with experienced physical abuse. Those who experienced physical abuse as well as psychological abuse told me that in the long run, the psychological abuse was far more damaging to them in their entire life. This is not to minimize physical abuse. This is to emphasize how damaging psychological abuse can be. So my understanding of psychological abuse comes from a lifetime of immersion experience in these environments, in the family, in relationships, and studying and working for 16 years in holistic healing and coaching. So in the last 6 years, I've specialized in a micro niche called narcissistic abuse, which is predominantly psychological abuse. And over working with these people, I've had the opportunity even to work with some people with PhDs, some in psychology, and also with some licensed psychotherapists who told me they didn't see it in their own life. They didn't see the patterns of the abuse, and that they also didn't learn how to recognize psychological abuse in their training programs. So today I want to talk about the two most important concepts from my perspective to understand in order to understand the individual experience who's been targeted by abuse in terms of what we're dealing with when people fall into the narrative, or even when evidence and information and truth is coming out and people continue to grab onto the narrative. Why would people choose to ingest an experimental substance, but also why would they comply with the narrative in general? And at the very end, I want to bring up a study from Yale University from 2020 that's going to bridge what Brian Garish was talking about last weekend. He was talking about the applied behavioral psychology. He brought up a study that was done, and he said that it could be used to change the way that people think and feel and behave. And so this Yale University study from 2020 basically gives us the keys to understanding the particular emotional manipulation tactics that they use. Now, they don't call it emotional manipulation. They call it COVID-19 vaccine messaging. And I'm not going to speak about the science because that's not my field. My field is recognizing the red flags of emotional abuse and manipulation. So that's what I'm going to speak on. So the first concept to understand about abuse is the cognitive dissonance. This is a survival mechanism that happens. So let's say a person has been cultivated to believe in a certain worldview or perspective or this narrative that was launched in 2020. And then all of a sudden you present to them some evidence or information that contradicts everything that they've believed up until then. The person is going to be unable to reconcile this conflict in their mind and in their brain. And what's going to happen is a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety on the nervous system, which triggers the amygdala circuit and almost a short circuit or hijacking of the brain, and the person goes into denial. So they won't be able to see that evidence. That's why as the truth more is coming out, people simply can't look at it. They might get angry at the messenger. They might simply turn away or cut somebody out of their life because they're trying to show them some evidence. Some people might be a little more aware of their cognitive dissonance. And when you try to show them the evidence, they might even tell you, I can't look at that because if what you're saying is true, I can't exist in a world like that. So this is the nature of cognitive dissonance. And this is what keeps people in this brain fog. And in the brain fog of the cognitive dissonance, that inner conflict, it's very difficult to think. So people have a very difficult time with cognitive processes, with critical thinking. And what they want to do is see the good in the abuser, in the perpetrator. So the second survival mechanism that happens is similar to cognitive dissonance, but more complex. Cognitive dissonance, from my perspective, is sort of like a level one. It's this conflict that happens in the dissonance in the brain. The level two is the Stockholm syndrome. There are more complex dynamics taking place here. So in interpersonal relationships, we typically call this a trauma bond. But with strangers, we call it Stockholm syndrome. The same mechanisms are taking place in the human brain and neurological system. So what's happening with Stockholm syndrome is there are 4 parameters, and I'm going to explain these in a very clear way that people can understand how this relates to what they've experienced and what they've witnessed in other people. And I'm going to give some examples too of how we've seen these 4 parameters show up in real life since 2020. So the very first one is isolation, and this could be either physical and or psychological isolation. The most important key here is that the person is isolated from outside perspectives. They can only have the perpetrator's narrative. So the perpetrator will make sure that they don't have access to outside perspectives, because this keeps a person completely subscribed to that narrative. So what scientists have discovered is that after a period of prolonged isolation, what happens is that chronically elevated stress levels begin to change a person's neurological system, changing then their ability to form social bonds, and even causing irritability and aggression when they're given a chance to participate in social situations. So the state that's caused after the isolation, the prolonged isolation, is disconnection. Disconnection in the polyvagal theory triggers the sense of unsafe. A person begins to feel unsafe when we're not socially connected. We are mammals. We rely on social connection in order to feel safe at a neurological level. So how the isolation played out in the world, there's been the domestic confinement, for example, where people were told to stay home with minimal social opportunities. And then how were they isolated by the perpetrator's narrative was through the technology. So in order to understand the individual experience, we also have to look at the environment in which the individual exists. And that is in a world of increasing technological dependence. So an individual is at home and they're constantly connected to their cell phone, to the internet, to the TV. They're listening to mainstream media. They're going on social media, and they're constantly bombarded with the repetition of that message. Even on corporations, there's a coordinated corporate messaging, repeating those same catchphrases that we're hearing from public officials and through the mainstream media. Even going shopping at a corporate grocery store, you're walking around the store at Walmart or Kroger, and in the background, constantly assaulting your subconscious, are the loudspeakers telling you those same messages about staying 6 feet apart and wearing your mask and getting vaccinations. And so in order to control a person's exposure to outside perspectives, what have we seen? We've seen censorship, silencing, propaganda, fact-checking, silencing, shaming, and smearing anybody providing that outside perspective. So this is essentially how the isolation phase took place. So the next phase of the Stockholm syndrome is the perceived acts of kindness. And this is part of the abuse cycle. So in an abusive relationship, it's going to go back and forth between idealization and devaluation, some sort of reward and then punishment. And so we call this intermittent reinforcement. And it goes back and forth. The perceived act of kindness is the idealization part. And so what that does is that causes a person to relax their guard, to begin to trust the perpetrator. And then the intermittent reinforcement and the intermittent reward causes a person to work harder to get that reward, to invest more in that relationship or that life situation, and to develop an almost obsession with compliance based on the hope of getting that reward. So the state that a person goes into due to this perceived act of kindness, and the key word here is perceived, because this isn't kindness coming from an abuser, it's a manipulation. But the nervous system and the person perceives it as an act of kindness. So the state that's caused here is almost an addiction to that hope, an addiction to the hope that this will be the time that they get the reward, or this will be the time that change for good happens. So how has this played out? Well, we've gone through phases of lockdowns and then some restoration of some freedom, some loosening of restrictions, and then lockdowns again, and then back and forth. We've been through this cycle multiple times since 2020. Currently, the trends around the world in many places, again, we're coming into this perceived act of kindness. We're hearing some governments are dropping some regulations. So what's going to happen? People's hopes are getting up again. They're going to be hoping that, oh, this is finally it. We're going back to normal. And that's the thing, that every victim in an abusive relationship is hoping to get back to the good times. So what we hear in society is people are hoping to get back to normal. Other acts of perceived kindness, we've seen so many, the free vaccine. We've also seen in America lotteries in some states, get vaccinated and win $50, $100, up to $1 million in some states. Other states offering French fries, donuts, guns, trucks. You can even get a free lap dance from a stripper in Las Vegas if you get your vaccine at that place. We've also seen mortgage and student loan forbearance, allowing people time to put that off. And we've heard promises of safety. It's for your good. It's because we care. These are perceived acts of kindness. And also, and this is a key, little bits and dosing of truth. So this perceived act of kindness is dosed periodically, almost like a drug, through the relationship or the situation. And so when they disclose little bits of truth and they let little bits of truth leak out, what happens, we get our hopes up again that finally the truth is coming out and we're going to be able to move on and move past this. So then the third parameter of the Stockholm Syndrome is a perceived life threat. So now we're getting into more serious state. So the nervous system, perceived is again the key word. When the autonomic nervous system perceives a cue of life threat in the environment, the person is automatically locked into an autonomic state of collapse. And this is over a period of time. This doesn't happen the first time. It happens after bombardment and shock trauma of fear messaging repeated over in the imagery that they've shown, utterly terrifying people. So over a period of time of that terror, what happens is the autonomic nervous system will immediately go into a state of immobilization. So in the state of immobilization, a person feels frozen. They may dissociate. They might check out, not really be present. So they're not really paying attention. They're in sort of an automaton behavior, which makes compliance and control a lot easier. And so also the brain fog that kicks in, and even a metabolic shutdown. So as the nervous system goes into this state of autonomic collapse, they may also go into metabolic shutdown. Now, the interesting thing is this state also leads a person to decreased immunity. Now, that's very interesting to notice because we're in a pandemic. And when a person is triggered into this state by the autonomic nervous system, endogenous opioids are also released in the body, which cause the person to stay numb. So that's helpful when a person is going through a lot of pain, but then that becomes maladaptive because that numbness keeps the person locked in this state. So it's very difficult to do anything, to take any action, because they are neurologically immobilized. So why are people so afraid? On one side, we've seen the messaging of the fear of the virus and also the fear of other people who they've been conditioned to believe are dangerous and diseased. And on the other side, a lot of people have become very afraid of the tyranny that's happening. So the fourth and final parameter of the Stockholm Syndrome is a perceived inability to escape. So the person is in this state of collapse for a while, and this goes on and on and on over a period of time. They become exhausted. They have no energy to try anything, to strive for anything. They go into a state what we call learned helplessness, which is also known as debility, dependency, dread, which causes apathy. And in this state of apathy, debility, and dread, a person starts to become hopeless. They feel utterly powerless over their life. They feel like everything is out of control. And what happens is when they're locked into this state, this very low state of consciousness, they don't even have access to the fight or flight system. It takes more energy. They don't even have the energy to fight or flight here. So they certainly don't have access to the higher states of consciousness, like critical thinking, the intellectual brain, or even things like imagination. So if a person cannot imagine the way out, how are they ever going to get out? And it's not that a person has to be locked behind prison doors. Most abuse victims walk out their door multiple times a day. They go to work, they go to school to pick up their kids, they do life, and they go back home, right? So it's the perceived inability to escape. And this person is so terrorized and so debilitated and so dependent on the abuser that they begin to believe that their survival is dependent on the perpetrator. They also lose complete capability for creativity and all of the beautiful things that make us human. And so what happens is in this state, it goes on and on and on. And over a period of time, this person becomes spiritually bankrupt. They lose all faith. And when all faith is lost, the only thing left is emptiness. And that word emptiness does not do justice for the feeling and the experience that a person has. It is the worst feeling that a human can have because you feel like you are untethered and lost and floating in the universe with no connection, no support, no promise for the future. And I think that a lot of people have been locked into this state. And so what happens is that people will escape into fantasy. So we've seen a huge increase in pornography. We've seen a huge increase in addictions, in overdoses, and we even see self-harm, huge increases in suicide. So why is this even possible? Because a lot of people's entire sense of reality is coming through the technology. It's coming through the media. It's coming through the social media. It's coming through contact with other people who are in this narrative. So this is a very difficult place. When a person is in this place, the mentality is, I can't. It's just everything is, I can't. So how can they possibly wake up? How can they possibly do anything other than what they're told by the abuser? And they learn that resistance is painful. So the example is the wife who experiences marital rape. And so she learns over a period of time that it's futile to resist and that resistance only leads to more pain. So just let him get it over with. And I've heard so many people say, I just wanted to get it over with. I just got my shot. You know, they're in this state. So the Stockholm Syndrome really, it explains why people stay in abusive relationships or situations like this narrative, why people return, why people cannot see the evidence that's coming, why people are irrationally loyal to these abusers and perpetrators, and why people even develop empathy for them. So do I have a few more minutes to show the Yale study?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I'm so sorry. Oh, password, I'm so sorry. Oh no, it wants me to quit Zoom. I'm so sorry. This is on clinicaltrials.gov. If anybody wants to look this up, clinicaltrials.gov, COVID-19 vaccine messaging, NIH, US National Library of Medicine. This was done at Yale University in July of 2020. And what they did is they used emotional manipulation messages like personal freedom, economic freedom, self-interest, community interest, economic benefit, guilt, embarrassment, anger, trust in science, and not bravery. The interesting thing is that they tell us straight away what their outcome measures are. Their primary outcome measure is intention to get the COVID-19 vaccine. So they want to know what a person's intention is to get it after 3 months or after 6 months of it becoming available. The secondary outcome measures, number one, vaccine confidence. So they want to know how much trust people can have or how they can influence people's trust in the vaccine. Number two, persuade others. So they want to know a person's willingness to persuade others to take the vaccine. Number three, fear of those who have not been vaccinated. Number four, social judgment of those who do not vaccinate. And they give you 4 items to measure the judgment of this person. Their trustworthiness. So if you don't get it, you're not trustworthy. Selfishness. If you don't get it, you're selfish. Likeableness. If you don't get it, you're not likable. Incompetence. If you don't get the vaccine, you're not competent. So they want to get people intended to get the vaccine. They want people's trust in the vaccine. They want people to persuade others to get it. They want people to be afraid of those who didn't get it. And they want people to socially judge those who didn't get the vaccine. And so that seems very clear that they're manipulating people about this vaccine. When we look at the messaging that they use, for example, trust in science, the premise here is that getting vaccinated against COVID-19 is the most effective way of protecting one's community. Vaccination is backed by science. If one doesn't get vaccinated, that means one doesn't understand how infections are spread or one who ignores science. The not bravery. For example, the frontline workers like firefighters and doctors are brave. Those who choose not to get vaccinated are not brave. Another one of the messaging that they've used, and this might already be ringing a bell to the jury who's thinking about the messaging that they've been hearing constantly for the last couple of years, community interest. So this message is about the dangers of COVID-19 to the health of loved ones. The more people who get vaccinated against COVID-19, the lower the risk that one's loved ones will get sick. Society must work together and all get vaccinated. So as I read through these, what I see is red flags. I even see gaslighting, which is the distortion of the perception of reality. For example, they say COVID-19 is wreaking havoc on the economy and people's economic freedoms. But that's actually not correct. It is the government regulations and restrictions and policies that are wreaking havoc on people's personal freedom and economic freedom and the economy. So I would love for any scientists to take a look at this study and see what they may want to say. I just wanted to speak about the red flags of abuse and manipulation. And I think that this study really provides that bridge to what Brian Garish was talking about using the applied behavioral psychology. This is an example in action of how they've done that and how they've manipulated people into taking this and not just taking it, but to do their bidding for them and to convince other people to get it.
When was this